have, like last time, some slides, but unlike last time, we're going to devote the majority of the time to getting your initial reactions to some of the thinking in two of the slides in particular. And they have to do with summarizing some of the strategic questions that I think evidence intermediaries, like all of us on the line, face as we think about how can we shape ESIC, the Evidence Synthesis Infrastructure Collaborative, to better meet our needs, and also how we can begin preparing now for a future in which ESIC will, I think in many ways, change how we go about aspects of our work. So I'm going to share my slides, and keep in mind there's two slides in particular that will be the basis of the conversation. Thanks to Carrie and Laura for facilitating the session last time. That was mostly catching people up on the process with the development of the ESIC roadmap, and talking about how the aspiration of ESIC is to create a step change improvement in how we produce and use evidence synthesis, particularly enabled living evidence synthesis. So we won't go through that in a lot of detail. I'll just summarize that from my perspective, and I think the perspective of many evidence intermediaries, this is an exciting time. So while there's a lot of bad news out there on many fronts, those engaged in providing timely, demand-driven evidence synthesis and support, I think are increasingly at the center of many conversations, and are at the center specifically of many conversations about how funding should flow in future to achieve bigger impacts with the evidence that we have and the evidence that we will generate in the future. And the group that we've convened through this process, we all play different roles. Some of us support advisory and decision-making processes, particularly ones that involve government policymakers or system and organizational leaders. So we have Laura Boer on the line from Veredas supporting Brazilian policymakers. I think I saw Josephine Watera join, who runs a research service for Ugandan parliamentarians. I don't think Adam's on the line, but we have Adam Day, who supports the Scientific Advisory Board for the UN Secretary General. And then there are others among us who run what we call learning and improvement platforms. You may have your own language for them. These are often supporting professionals, other service providers. I think of people like Perola Vanvik, who runs Magic App, focused primarily on physicians and other healthcare providers. John Kay, who couldn't be with us today, who at EEF, the Education Endowment Foundation, supports the teaching and learning toolkit focused on teachers. And then there are others among us who support efforts to put evidence at the center of everyday life. So support everyday individuals, citizens in the broadest sense of that term, not referring to who governments choose to consider citizens, but all of us. And as I've alluded to, I think ESIC will transform aspects of how we do our work, particularly how we learn from studies and evaluations and other work done in other countries. Not that that will ever take away from the really important work that we do, bringing together many forms of national and local evidence. But I think what will be so exciting in the future is we'll be able to mix and match those needed forms of evidence from our local environments with insights from other similar contexts in other parts of the world. So we need to start preparing now for this step change improvement in how we produce and use evidence synthesis. And now is the time to make sure that evidence intermediaries shape ESIC's trajectory, and that we start strategizing now about how we'll contribute to and benefit from it. So keep in mind from this slide, this notion that we represent collectively a mix of people focused on very different target audiences, policymakers, professionals, citizens, but we're, I think, all united by our focus on trying to get the right evidence to the right people at the right time to help achieve impacts on everyday people. Some of you will know the Show Me the Evidence consensus. I just wanted to note that evidence intermediaries, like all of us, appear in two of the features. So number one, support systems nationally that use many forms of research evidence, including evidence synthesis, to help address local priorities, but also in feature 5, measured communications that clarify what we know from existing evidence and with what caveats. ESIC then comes along as feature two, a really bold effort to harmonize efforts globally to make it easier to learn from others around the world. And I see these things as powerfully complementary. You'll have seen this slide last time from Carrie and Laura that ESIC, I think, will be a game changer for evidence intermediaries and for others. I won't go through it in detail, just to say that what we anticipate as evidence intermediaries will have data on tap from these living evidence syntheses that you can then contextualize in a variety of ways. Some may contextualize it as best buys, others as a contextualized evidence synthesis, others in other forms. And then we will also have actionable insights that can be used directly by policymakers and other decision makers. And we'll also be able to use ESIC to support feedback loops that we hope will reduce research waste and make it easier to document research impact. But it's those evidence intermediary roles that we're particularly keen to discuss. So finally, we come to the first of the two key slides, which I'll walk you through, and then I'm hoping to go row by row and get your reactions to it. So the way that these two key slides are set up is they ask the question, how well does report 3 meet the needs of evidence intermediaries, and what needs to be added or changed? So as Laura and Carrie explained last time, there are 5 working groups, each focused on one of the infrastructure elements that ESIC will support, and a governance planning group. So working group 1 focused on demand-side engagement, and we have some members of this group on the line, Carrie, Peter Bragg, probably others. This group in part is addressing in report 3, how do we address and respond to windows of opportunity, and how do we meet user needs with context and issue-specific evidence products and processes. And if you read through report 3, you'll see the group is calling for demand-side secretariats organized regionally, implementation support to evidence intermediaries, co-design, or I think maybe more accurately called co-production labs for these evidence syntheses, and then question banks. And I have another slide about how we set collective priorities. So what we'd love to hear from you is, what are your reactions to this? And particularly, how can we build on the lessons learned from the UN Regional Issue-Based Coalition? So when we see notes about regional demand-side secretariats, it's important to know as context that a lot of people in the UN system are not convinced that the UN Regional Issue-Based Coalitions have been achieving desired impact. So if that's the case, how do we learn from those lessons? Do we build up from country nodes? And Laura, it would be good to get your feedback here, because I think HubLAC is an example of building up successfully from country nodes. Working across target audiences, does it help if the same groups in a country who are acting as evidence intermediaries, some focused on government policymakers, others on service providers, others on citizens, work in a slightly more joined up way? And does it help to have clear pathways to impact for each? So those are some questions to think about for what Working Group 1 is proposing. Working Group 2 is proposing that we move to a world where we extract data once from a study, assess quality once, and then evidence intermediaries, like all of us, use the data many times in creating context and issue-specific evidence products and processes. And when we do that, we'll have to go back and try to make accessible all the stocks of existing data that have been created over the years, but we also then need to do this in real time going forward. So the questions that I think all of us need to ask as evidence intermediaries, we ourselves have extracted a lot of data, done a lot of quality assessments. What would it take for us to contribute our data? Or do you think it should just be groups that produce global public goods who contribute data, and those that contextualize them to a given country can focus on using the global public good data? Another question for you, are we ready to add data analysts to our role? So if this working group is successful in making the case for data sharing and reuse, a lot of us are going to be playing a data analyst role. When questions come in, we will not be extracting data ourselves. We will be pulling it down from a cloud and deciding what of those data are relevant to our context and the groups that we are most focused on. And then third, and this is still not official, but my understanding is a major funder is likely to be putting money into ed labs to begin to pilot what does it look like to have access to an evidence data repository that you can then contextualize to your country's needs. That's going to be a really exciting opportunity for all of us to learn from the ed labs. And then if we move on to working group 3, they are proposing that we move to a world where we use AI tools for discrete tasks in evidence synthesis and support as performance metrics allow. And some of the things that I think evidence intermediaries like all of us will be able to benefit from is they're proposing a living document where we'll be able to find each AI tool for each tool, each synthesis task it's suited for, and the performance metrics for those tasks. That will help us make decisions about which tools we use in our own work. They're proposing new reporting standards or extensions of existing reporting standards to ensure we report on and justify our use of AI tools in our work. They're proposing that we continue with something like the RAISE guidance, living guidance for how we use artificial intelligence in synthesis, and have a related compliance framework. And then finally, they're proposing AI digital evidence synthesis tools, what they call AI desks, specific to our needs as evidence intermediaries. So the questions, I think, for us as a community of evidence intermediaries are we ready for a higher level of expectations and accountability for our use of AI tools? And will those first 3 solutions, the living document, reporting standards, and living guidance, give us what we need? Then the second question, what AI desks do we most urgently need as a community? And then finally, how can we ensure that our context issue and sector-rich products and processes are used as training data sets and walled gardens for AI tools and used to build prompts? So I think we collectively as evidence intermediaries sit on a treasure trove of context issue and sector specific products and processes. How can we make sure that that is used in creating the right tools? I'll just move on, and apologies, I know I'm talking a lot. It's because I just want to unpack the full list and then go back one by one. Working group 4 is about making evidence synthesis radically more timely, relevant, and affordable. And this group, its recommendations are in a way the most like a laundry list. It is a very long list currently. How I bucketed their proposals are first working in more agile ways and at greater scale. So more agile in the sense of perhaps standing up a living product in 1 week, which a number of us as evidence intermediaries have done in the past, and a greater scale. Rather than going in intervention by intervention, what are all of the interventions that can support something like peace building? Second, adjusting approaches to different levels. So a lot of comments in the document about how methods have often been built under the lamppost of areas that are easier, like does this drug work better than that drug? But as we move from individual products and services to population-based interventions and on to how do we organize ourselves to get the right mix of programs and services to people, things get more complicated. Or as we move from health to other sectors, things get more complicated. So how do we adjust to different levels and sectors? And then how do we scale up or develop new approaches to timely demand-driven contextualization at the country level or for priority groups, which is the bread and butter for many of us? How do I learn from a new innovation that Laura's using in Brazil or a new approach that Josephine has developed in Uganda? So the question for all of you here is their interest in learning across the many silos in evidence intermediary world. with a particular focus on understanding where similar versus different approaches make sense. So why is it that Laura and our group use broadly similar approaches, but when we look at the embedded evidence labs, we see a different set of approaches? Is that because of their context or the nature of the issues they address, or is it just that we haven't been yet exposed to each other's work? And could we, in fact, be using many of the embedded evidence lab approaches? And also, when are we using different language to mean the same thing and the same language to mean different things? And then second to last one, working group 5, capacity sharing. This group has talked about sharing capacity for evidence use, particularly evidence synthesis use. And they do zero in on the critical role of evidence intermediaries. They're not as explicit about our new role as evidence data analysts, but they are, like working group 1, proposing a regional focus for these capacity sharing efforts. They also, perhaps of less immediate interest to many of us, are focused on sharing capacity for evidence synthesis in the sense of producing global public goods. And they're very focused appropriately on something that ESIC has foregrounded, supporting a transition in leadership and execution to the global south. So questions for you: do we agree that capacity for evidence use should focus on the use of the many needed forms of local evidence and evidence synthesis, not just the latter? My worry is it feels like we're developing another set of silos focused on the use of one form of evidence, but I think as evidence intermediaries, we're really well positioned to help people use many forms of evidence, one of which would be evidence synthesis. And do you agree that we should work with existing programs? So if there's a National Evaluations Capacities Conference organized every 2 years by UNDP, should we be trying to get this thinking into that program rather than start brand new ones? And then another question: do contextualized evidence synthesis products, like the ones many of us produce, fit under capacity for evidence use or capacity for evidence synthesis? And I think how we frame our work is going to be really important. Then the final set of recommendations are about governance. How do we govern for collective impact? And you'll see in this report talk about perhaps governance mechanisms being organized in 4 ways: by interest holder. And I personally think that if ESIC doesn't work for evidence intermediaries like all of us, it will fail in achieving some of its biggest potential impacts. So I think of evidence intermediaries as being first among equals among the ESIC interest holders. Second, some aspects of governance will work by technical area. So we may need groups specifically focused on working through the governance of data sharing. There's also proposals of having a governance dimension by region, and we already have networks, including some represented on the call, where we have regional nodes that are well suited to play that role. And then there's also governance with a sectoral focus. And you'll see 2 examples here, one focused on education, one for health, where there's organization by sector. So the question for you here is there interest in organizing ourselves, evidence intermediaries, as a peak body, sitting alongside the Network for Government Science Advice, sitting alongside other ones that are organized by technical area, by region and sector? Do you see value in us coming together as a community of evidence intermediaries? So that's the summary. I'll go back to the first of the 2 key slides and open it up. If we could go row by row and get your reactions to some of these ideas. So for demand side engagement, my big question for you is, how do we organize ourselves regionally in ways that would achieve big impacts? Because some people have told us this has not worked particularly well in the future. So I'll open it up for any initial reactions to that. Laura, it may be particularly good to get your reaction here, because I think you've been very successful in bringing together country teams with a more of a regional focus through HubLAC. Do you have any reactions on demand side engagement?
Yeah, I have some. The first reaction, John, just overall to share with the colleagues that maybe are not participating so actively in this conversation is that I often feel that for some colleagues, they really imagine that if we have a super AI field bank of evidence, people will just start using evidence. And this will magically happen. And I think as evidence intermediaries, there is a point we need to make each and every time to both evidence producers and some funders that this is not enough. This won't make people start using evidence out of nowhere. And it's really, really, really key that we have mechanisms to properly engage, to make people aware both of the great potential and the caveats of this type of solution and be very honest about this. Otherwise, it is a lot of money, but will serve mainly just evidence producers, right? Um, in terms of the solutions that the demand-side engagement propose, I think there are very interesting solutions here, but in our experience, the only reason I would say like the Africa Evidence Network or maybe the Latin America and the Caribbean Evidence Hub work is because we started with a strong foundation at country level. So I think if you just start with a regional body, this will be hard. People have to have a read on their country and they have to have legitimacy in their country for the regional body to work. So when I hear like building up from country nodes, yes. And I also think that we really need to understand like the regional aspect for me is more a governance aspect than a solution itself.
Mm,
It's just understanding that the more we learn from countries that have similar contexts, the better we can develop our engagement and we can use examples that people feel close. Because if I say, oh, in Canada, there is this great thing, the Brazilian government says to me, yeah, but this is Canada. They are wonderful, they are rich, they are amazing, like we are Brazil. But if I say in Colombia, we have this, they are, "Huh,
mhm,
how come we have this in Colombia and not in Brazil, you know?
mhm,
So yes, building from country nodes, and yes, understanding that the regional bodies much more about peer support, cross learning, using examples that are close to our reality than necessarily, or even developing question banks that have similar questions and similar concerns than necessarily a solution on itself. But I really like the co-production labs. I really like the idea of question banks. And I think the demand side secretariats, if regional, they only work if we have a strong national presence first. So
mhm,
we need
mhm,
to like identify who already has legitimacy in this end and like have some other countries that are still building on this and a nice mix to share capacity in this sense. But I think the man-side engagement is very key, and I would reinforce that if we can have a message as evidence intermediaries, is that a very big, beautiful technological solution won't make people start using evidence out of
mhm.
nowhere.
Yep.
I think this is a key message as a group that we need to keep pushing because often we go back to the tech solution and we forget about this other mechanism.
Absolutely. Great. And let me just say, I mentioned this other slide. This other slide, it's the only other substantive one that is in the deck, is just that the Global SDG Synthesis Coalition has been thinking about how do you surface priorities within these question banks. And so a lot of their attention has been on this approach of, well, we've tried to identify shared independent evaluation office needs at the level of the SDG pillars, like the people pillar, the planet pillars. So how do we scale that up? But what they're also trying to do is figure out how do we surface priorities from intergovernmental processes? Like if we know that the IPCC has an evidence deadline of 2027, how do we gear up for that? But also how at the country team level, whether it's the UN country team or in countries in crisis, the humanitarian country team, how do we identify emergent questions that they urgently need to ask? What I think would be critical is to add an additional row here saying, how do evidence intermediaries surface questions? And if in the Latin American region, uh, Brazil surfaces a question, but Colombia says, yes, that's on our agenda too. Argentina says the same, then it bubbles to the top as a more urgent priority for collective work. So do people agree that evidence intermediaries will be a powerful way to surface questions? And when there are shared needs across countries, then those would get prioritized. So let's go back to demand side engagement. I know we have a couple of working group members on the line, Carrie and Peter, for example. What's your reaction to the evidence intermediary take? Because when you were doing this work, you were thinking of all the interest holders. But now if we say, what do evidence intermediaries most need to be advocating for? Any reactions to what you see here? Carrie?
I think I agree very strongly with what Laura said. I still think there's something missing in there in the demand side engagement group to deal with, and Peter's heard me say this now a lot, this kind of last mile problem. And I think it comes to what Laura is saying too, of, we can build all the infrastructure we want, and even we can have all the intermediaries we want, but at the end of the day, it doesn't necessarily mean that folks are going to use evidence syntheses. So there's work in there that needs to be done, I think, that starts to surface some of the solutions, and hearing from our colleagues around the globe about what has been done that works well for them, I think, is a critical piece of that. Which comes to my second point of, I think it's both A and B for your question of building up country nodes, but also working across target audiences. And the target audience piece comes in because where we have had the most success within country of moving forward with similar target audiences is to say, your colleagues in this department are doing this already. Can you build on that? Or saying to a professional body, the nurses are doing this already. Can we work with physiotherapists to do this, et cetera? And you need that comparison, I think, to get a little bit further within country.
Super, really helpful. Shelley-Ann, sorry, I didn't see you on the list initially. Am I right that you're actually the one leading with this group? This is
So I'm the planning analyst
yes,
for the group.
great, super.
Not necessarily leading. And again, I really want to reinforce what Laura said this morning. I'm part of the Latin American and Caribbean Evidence Hub. And we did have a working group meeting yesterday. And again, regional secretariats is something that's continuously discussed. And one of the things I want to bring to this group is the need, these caveats where we talked about the need to have feasibility studies before establishing these regional secretariats. So it's important to know what already exists, what is working well. Can this secretariat fit within an existing organization, network, or hub? Can this secretariat support all countries within the regions, So there's certain caveats that accompany these options, as we call them, or solutions, as we call them. And it just was almost impossible to drill down the report. But the need to understand what is happening in regions before we launch out into this is quite important. And it's something that the group continues to consider.
Super. Thank you very much, Shelley-Ann. Peter, could we go to you?
Yeah, a couple of observations. So we got some pretty direct feedback about the word establish demand side secretariats, and I think it really was quite telling that people didn't want an infrastructure built, firstly, where there is rich existing infrastructure, and secondly, and personally, in advance of understanding what the questions are. I think Laura's point about the behavioural incentives is absolutely critical, which is why, the very first thing I would do would be to establish question banks and let needs rise to the surface, because the single biggest behavioural driver of evidence use is someone needs to solve a problem where evidence use can be used. So if I think about the work I'm doing now with the National Disability Insurance Scheme, they want to know what are the therapies that we should fund based on the research evidence. So that's the place we're going to get traction. And so I really do want to reiterate what Laura and Kerry said, that we have to resist the temptation to think that the magical thinking of behavioural incentives is that there's a big shiny thing, because it's actually what's the problem that they need to solve.
Great. Really nicely said, Peter. That's great. Other reactions, so far we're hearing from the folks who are really embedded in the planning process, but we really want to hear from folks for whom this is new. I saw folks on the line from Ireland, Uganda, a number of other countries. Any reaction to what you're seeing the demand side group propose and or the questions that I've proposed to get us to strategically think about how we want to shape this thinking in the next round. Any reactions from Josephine or others on the line about where the effort needs to go on demand side engagement?
I'd
go
I
ahead.
come in?
Yes.
Sorry, I was
great.
looking for the hand, but I haven't been on
Yeah.
Zoom
No,
recently.
come up, mute anytime.
Thanks. So I'm Paul Plantinga from Human Sciences Research Council in South Africa. So I've been very disconnected from this process and a real newcomer. So sorry if I'm really coming in on the side. I work with people like Hirsch and others in South
Yes.
Africa that you might
Great.
be connected to. We do it in a very fragmented way, so we get involved in some of these spaces off and on. But I think the one thing just from my side, really interested in the discussion on the regional nodes. Yeah, I think I agree with what the others have said. I think we've struggled with the credibility of the the more formal regional entities in terms of supporting local systems. Whereas I think the regional nodes can have quite specific defined roles that are more oriented to learning and exchange. And I think if it is kind of limited to those specific areas and quite well defined in those specific areas, then that could be great. The other, I was just interested in the discussion around incentives because it is something that we do deal with a lot. Maybe I'm not as optimistic as feeling that our colleagues, I mean, we work closely in the space with a lot of government colleagues on things, so I suppose we share incentives, but I think a lot of the case, I think as someone mentioned earlier on one of the previous calls, is about being seen to use evidence and also closely connected to personal career development. So if we can, and I don't really see it here, and it might have been discussed before, but if we had a sense of how the end users can connect some of this evidence work to personal career pathways, professional development, that kind of thing, it would be potentially quite attractive, I feel. And then just one last point, just around on end users again, is we're working on some platforms. Some are more technology driven, and just looking at ways to have pathways that are very incremental. So just interested in what the thoughts are around kind of mapping out adoption pathways from a technology practice perspective and how those can be captured in a somewhat incremental way. Thanks.
Yeah, really, really great points, Paul. And it's exactly folks like you who haven't been involved in the process whose voices we need to hear from. I love the idea of connecting this to personal career development pathways. And that's something that I think we need to bring back to the capacity sharing group as a hook for some aspects of what they're doing. And then I think a lot of the evidence intermediaries, including probably many on the line, are very focused on having mapped those adoption pathways in their own countries, then trying to work within them to respond to windows of opportunity. So I think that's how a lot of this group would operate, but that may not be visible to our peers in the other ESIC conversations, which is why we need to elevate it in these types of conversations. So that kind of wording is also going to be really helpful to make sure it's front and center and others understand the need to support that mapping work and then acting on what's learned from the mapping. Carrie, any other hands up or comments in the chat box? Otherwise, maybe we'll go on to working groups 2 and 3.
Lots of hands up. So
oh, great. Super.
Josephine, and then also our friends, colleagues from Ireland, and Freyas Thoto as well.
Whoops, sorry. Hi, Josephine.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, yes, yep.
Yeah, so one, I really want to thank all members and you leading us through this session. I believe the demand side is very important because these are the guys who we are, stretching all our energies for. And so we just want to be sure that they're getting what they desire. And so I love it that we're talking about the products and processes, and also that we want to zoom in into country nodes because we are at different levels in terms of development of infrastructure, in terms of the national evaluation system, in terms of political will, in terms of resourcing, even the financial and human resource. So I think this is a very good approach for us to zoom in and understand how we can actually cause impact on the demand side. What I would also wish to add is to do comparative, because we may get very stretched out if we go individual country nodes. But if we also look at, and I like it that we're talking about the regional, to have a picture so that we have one comparative picture of Southern Africa, we have one comparative picture of East Africa, so that we pick a kind of a macro image of what we are dealing with and be able to run off with this. Because if we go very low, it may be hard to zoom it in. So I agree that we go in purposes of learning and drawing the raw or primary source for our lessons, but at a later stage, zoom this together and pull it together so that we have a picture that is regional based, so that we can be clear on issues of products and processes and also context, and be able to ensure that the right target audience is the one that we are actually dealing with. So I'm in support of this. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you very much, Josephine. And your point, as you noted, connects with Paul's earlier point that if the regions are focused on learning and exchange and in part supported by that understanding of the macro picture, then everybody can operate better at the country level. Laura gave the example of Brazil being inspired by the Colombian example, not the Canadian one. People want to learn from their peers. So really good points, and really helpful to have you reinforce the idea of the importance of the demand side engagement and the recognition that different countries are at different levels and we need to support them from where they are to whatever the next step that makes sense for them. Carrie, could you help me every time I touch the screen to try to see who's in the queue? I move the slide.
Sure. So our Irish colleagues are next.
Great.
So Seth and Barbara.
Great.
Thanks, John. I hope you can listen to me.
Yeah.
I really agree with the approach of building up from the country nodes, as well as there should be an approach at the regional level. I'm just thinking, how far should we contextualize this at country level? Because even within a same region, there might be a different level of understanding of evidence at user level or demand side level, even among the policymakers. Maybe in some countries, some are very well known to this and are in practice. In some countries, they know it but do not practice. And even in some countries, they don't even know about this. So how will that be considered? That is one point. Another point is, again, to be honest, I'm telling this from my personal experience because I'm actually from Bangladesh, and I know how the policy decisions are made in the similar countries or in countries like Bangladesh. So sometimes it's just like a one-man decision, or it's a political decision, or often it's being very much influenced from the donors. So should that be that consideration as well, like to engage the donors or the other perspective that might influence some decision in countries, specifically in low and middle income countries or countries from global south?
Absolutely, yeah. So I agree that, you're asking really important questions on both sides. There is huge variability within countries, so we need to have approaches that work for the folks who already buy into the notion, but also the folks for whom this is new and or not something that they're currently interested in. And yes, in many countries, donors absolutely critical part of it. And so if in part what we're doing is mapping these pathways to impact, and the donor engagement piece is going to be a part of the puzzle in many, many countries. So again, both excellent points. And the nice thing is evidence intermediaries tend to know those landscapes. They know the role of donors. They know how those donors play out their roles on different issues and so on. So they can be part of the target audience that they're trying to influence or inform. Carrie, could we go to...
So Freyas is next from the African Center for Equitable Development.
Great.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me very well. Yeah.
Yes.
So yeah, thanks, David. I'm quite new to this process. I'm Freyas Toto from the African Center for Equitable Development. We are a knowledge translation organization specializing mostly in Francophone Africa and doing different kind of work around evidence intermediary work. The first point I want to raise here is that I'm saying that we are having a kind of focus on what we usually call evidence, but we all know now that in practice, evidence is just one element in the whole policy making process. So how are we going to integrate other forms of knowledge? How do we integrate, for example, the insights that the policymakers can get from their own knowledge or from their own perspective that could come from the political positioning or from the donors or from the private sector. So we should also embrace different kinds of knowledge. We usually talk a lot also about indigenous knowledge, but so far it's quite difficult to see clearly how do we mainstream this in the whole evidence informed policy making process. And this led me to the second point where as I mentioned, I'm quite new to this process, so I don't know the extensive discussion that have happened before, but it seems like we are having a kind of focus on evidence synthesis here and a kind of technology. But this could just be, tools that will help us as evidence intermediaries in doing a better work. But we know that in the field, at the country level, when we are supporting policy processes, it's more about collaboration, it's more about legitimacy, it's more about who are you talking to, do you really understand the power dynamics in place in a particular sector? How do we also take all those into account and not just a focus on another big infrastructure or technology that we are putting in place to advance the EIP system? Thank you very much.
Great. So really important points. And I think, my knowledge of the evidence intermediaries on the line, all of us would agree very much with what you've said, that, evidence is one input, and many of our processes that many of us are engaged in support many other inputs to come into play, local ways of knowing, including indigenous ways of knowing, interest group pressure, all those dynamics. So wholeheartedly agree, but we are using evidence as a way in how do we get evidence among those other inputs. And then on your other point, and Laura emphasized this as well, for whatever reason, funders have been caught by the shiny new penny of AI-enabled living evidence syntheses. But the exciting part is these working groups are saying, it's fine that we have a shiny new penny, but if we're not doing all of these other things that you described, we're not going to have an impact. So the collaborations, the legitimacy, all those things that are built up by well-positioned local intermediate or evidence intermediaries in countries, I think are critical to this having any impact, which is why this demand-side engagement is so key. So I suspect many others would wholeheartedly agree with both of your important points.
So Lucy's next, but I would
Great.
just encourage, because we have about 13 minutes left, if folks have big ideas about any of the other working group questions, please feel free to put them in the chat and I can make sure to capture them.
Great. Lucy?
Go ahead.
Yes, thank you. Sorry, I just want to add one idea. Well, I'm just doing from children. I worked several years in the Ministry of Health, and what I believe is missing in the demand-side engagement is to understand the role of the knowledge worker. I believe that most of the time I've listened to knowledge workers became like an obstacle for the decision makers to make free decisions based on their own rationals. And there is a struggle also with other study departments. So sometimes when we try to build like this institutionalization, then it's why it's different. Why should we create a new study department? And we need to be able to make awareness that this is not only elaborating an evidence synthesis, but it's transforming right information or interactions. So I believe that the skills of the knowledge worker should be better developed or really nested, right? Like not only people searching on the laptops or computers, but being able to have a high level conversation with that decision. That's it. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Lucy. Very much agree. Absolutely. All right. So as Carrie noted, we don't have very much time. I wanted to give a lot of time to the demand side engagement because that group is really centering evidence intermediaries. Maybe we can quickly see what people's reactions are to the two more technically focused groups, data sharing and reusing, safe and responsible use of AI. Reactions to these questions, it feels to me like many of us need to develop a new skill as data analysts. We're not used to managing data flows of the types that may happen in the future. Our group, for example, has only a few times been able to get a question in, like on climate solutions, contact our colleague Jan Minks, get the data dump from his extraordinary data set of all the studies in the world dealing with climate solutions, pull out the studies that were done in contexts like ours or that used interventions relevant to our context, and then contextualize those findings for our local decision makers. So we've only done that a few times. This may in future become the new normal, that we're downloading data, quickly manipulating it, and then presenting the relevant pieces of it for our local environment alongside all of the needed forms of local evidence. That's a big change. Some of you may already be using AI digital evidence synthesis tools in your roles as evidence intermediaries. What do we most urgently need in terms of products that would help us do our work better or more efficiently? So any quick reactions to the data sharing and reusing side or the safe and responsible use of AI solutions? Peter.
Yeah, I've got a PhD student in this space, and I think what we most need is empirical evidence that the AI tools actually do what they say on a box. There's a review I can share which just came out a few weeks ago about the use of AI, which was a bit of a wake-up call, I think, for a lot of people that think it's just going to kind of, ask the question and give the answer. So what I think we most need is head-to-head trials of AI versus business as usual, or even historical comparisons against reviews we've done, because a lot of the people who are researching this space just simply say that the empirical evidence is not there in terms of it being reliable and valid and safe to use.
Great. So it sounds like the most important in a way then for you is that first sub-bullet under AI living document with each tool synthesis, task, performance metrics, and informed by head-to-head analyses. Okay, really helpful. Other reactions to the data sharing, reusing, or the AI piece? What messages as evidence intermediaries do you most want to have people take on board about how you need to be supported in these two issues, in these two areas? Thanks, Peter, for that link. Carrie?
It's a bit of a different direction than other folks have gone in, because I think that the kind of big picture of global public goods is well covered by both of these groups. The pieces that I struggle with a little bit, under your first piece around working group for data sharing and reusing, what would it take for us to contribute our data? There's a challenge around, I think, not having set standards or methods or really good ideas of what we mean by contextualization in the work that we do that mean moving from public goods to decision making. And I think we need to get a little bit more standardization in order to start to contribute that data.
Whoops.
And And I would also say that that flows a little bit into some of my ideas around AI. I think there's people that are much better than me suited that are moving forward in the kind of how you use AI and evidence syntheses. But there is a piece that I think that's missing of, are there ways to use AI that support the contextualization, whether it's understanding policy developments or understanding how systems work, or working towards those kind of quick pieces that allow us to contextualize evidence a little bit more? I don't know what they look like, but I think that there's somewhere in there that we can do some thinking that would come up with some really interesting, useful solutions.
That's great. And I'm sorry, I moved the slides around there. I was just looking to see, because Working Group 4 does talk about standards and contextualization. I don't think they are as clear that we need standards for contextualization. So how do we describe it? How do we document it? Similar. So I think you're onto something very important there that we need to lift out. And then, yes, AI, digital evidence synthesis tools that help us with dimensions of the contextualization process would be something important to prioritize in the list. Can we go to our colleagues from Ireland?
Thanks, John. One quick reaction regarding the safe and responsible use of AI is, I think AI digital evidence synthesis tool is required, but the question is, so far there's no validated tool. And also the second thing is, the available tools or available works that are ongoing for utilization of AI in evidence synthesis are focusing on parts of the processes. So is there a complete, I don't know whether in future we will have something that gives a complete package, starting from the question to the recommendation. And the most important thing is where we should focus that while using the AI, we should have certain points where validation by experts or human are still required.
Yes.
So possibly it's done by AI, but we need to have that space where human can intervene or can have the validation that is done by AI.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think that, the AI working group does often talk about human in the loop. So how do you bring humans in at key points, including, as you noted, the validation piece. And then they also talk about the fact that, yes, we have tools for certain tasks, but not all of them. And right now, there's no way to follow through a process that does it all for you. What they're currently envisioning is something that would allow you to navigate through the tasks and then use the right tool for the right purpose, and it would be more user driven. So it's starting to get in the direction of what you're talking about, but right now it's an aspiration. So in the interest of time, let me move on to the other table. So the methods and process innovation, in a way, is, as I mentioned before, it's more a really long list. And I think to me, the big aha was, if you look at all the ways that they touch on methods and process innovation for evidence intermediaries, it feels like the next step for all of us is to start to better learn from each other, because I think there's so much methods and process innovation happening in our space, but what we're not doing very well is learning from each other. So we learn from peers we know well, like Laura and Lawrence and others, but we're not learning from the embedded evidence labs. We're not learning from some of the What Works centers. How do we change that? And then for capacity sharing and reusing, when you read that document, it feels like we're creating a whole new infrastructure just for capacity sharing. I don't know, it feels to me like we should be embedding our capacity sharing in other existing programs. And then for governance, my big question for all of you is, do we need to get better organized as a community so that we're thinking through these issues together? We're informing things like ESIC with more of a collective voice, and so on. So any reactions to some of the key points on this slide about how we work as a community to advance methods, to share capacity, and to make sure our voices are involved in shaping the future of initiatives like this one? Peter.
Yeah, it's interesting. Some of the things we've been doing lately have been more what we would characterize as being thought partners and actually helping people navigate through what questions might be better addressed by evidence synthesis, where you might gather other data, like more of a, like, I guess what you would call a consultant type role. So I think in the governance planning group, the idea that we're not just suppliers of, you want this, we're going to review this, but more thought partners. And the one tool I always pull out is the matching QM tool. I mean, that's a classic helping people think through a problem. And I think that in terms of the collective impact, I think the idea of being humble thought partners and being at the table with others and being honest about where evidence synthesis can add value and where other things might have more weight, and also just looping back to what others said about the role of political imperatives and donor preferences and things. I think that there is a bit of nuance that's missing a little bit from the whole sort of like, you want this, we'll go do it.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. I was on a call yesterday with a behavioral science leader who asserted that they are the ones who are best positioned to be what I call the general contractor, or what you just called the thought leader, helping people navigate what do they need for what uses. And I said, it is the case that behavioral science people often have many of the skills to move into that role, but there are other people who have come into that role from other pathways who are really good at that stuff as well. Laura, Christiane, many other people. So, and that to me is the quintessential evidence intermediary role. We acknowledge that we need many forms of evidence, that we need to be attentive to Indigenous ways of knowing, that you need to understand how policy is made or why clinicians make certain decisions in order to mix and match what's needed for a given purpose. So how do we elevate those voices of the people on this call so that they are heard as a group whose thought leadership needs to be at the table for governance, for innovation, for capacity sharing? Any reactions?
John.
Yes.
It's Lou from Brazil.
Yeah.
I've been working with the working group 4, and then what I see, John, I don't know if you can contribute, but I can give you idea that Monday and Tuesday we were in a meeting in Brazil, putting together some very different sectors, for example, environmental, education, health, social, etc. What do we see, John, is that when we talk about health has some methodology that sometimes don't talk with the other sectors, don't talk with education. For example, the Ministry of Education in Brazil is very behind when you see the health ministry here. So I don't know, I don't have the answer, but I see that the methods or some innovation that we are using in health, we don't share with the other sectors. This is the other problematic things, we were discussing this there, how to use the green literature, the GRIS literature to because all other sectors, they work with more gray literature than the other type of literature. So I don't know.
Great.
It's very difficult. We need to include them.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you.
The second bullet in working group 4, it says adjusting approaches to different levels and different sectors, because I agree, it does look different in other sectors. So let's continue to learn from them and think about how we adapt approaches that may have worked in one sector to others. Carrie, I'm just going to go on to the wrap-up slides, but did something else come in the chat box?
It's from me, though, so it's fine.
Okay. So just a reminder of where we are, report 4A. So report 3 was the long list of solutions. So now we're moving into group sense of the high impact solutions. Those will be posted on Monday, which is the 26th of May. So do keep in mind that I've been talking about what I drew out from a long list. Now we need to see what stayed in the high impact solutions list, which will start to become available on Monday. And then about 10 days later, we'll have the costed versions of those solutions. For those who haven't seen it, there's a call to action from our citizen leaders that's now up on the evidence synthesis infrastructure collaborative planning website. There are also some really important outputs that have been developed by the Global SDG Synthesis Coalition, one on how do we prioritize topics, one on pathways to impact, and the draft ESIC roadmap will be released on the 13th of June. And then this just summarizes that in a slightly different way. Carrie, can you remind me when we're bringing this group back together? It will be once the roadmap's available.
June 17th.
Great. So the roadmap will come out on June the 13th. And so the focus of our next conversation will be, did we see the types of things that all of you raised in today's conversation reflected in the roadmap? And then if not, then we need to think about how do we work through those people who are on the call who will be in Cape Town to make sure that the perspectives of evidence intermediaries are heard in Cape Town. Carrie and Laura, would you, I don't know if Laura's still on the line, would you add anything else for now?
Laura had to run to a meeting.
Okay.
No, other than please feel free to put anything in the chat box quickly and I'll make sure it gets captured. And if you have any, we'll circulate notes after the meeting. So if you have responses to them, feel free to send them to John and I. We know it's tough on the spot to come up with big solutions.
Great. Super. Thanks very much, everybody. Have a good rest of the day. I'm sorry we went a few minutes over time. Bye-bye.